All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into this really kind of fascinating philosophical debate, about how we go about understanding, like, the social world around us, right?
Mm.
Methodological holism and the
Mm.
social sciences is a big one. And, you've sent us some really interesting sources, and I think our goal here is kind of like unpack what's at stake in this whole discussion.
Absolutely. I mean, this is like fundamental stuff if you're thinking about how we explain social phenomena, right? It gets to the heart of like how we build theories about society. So, yeah, we're asking like when we see things happening in society, should we focus on the big social stuff? The institutions, the structures, the norms, or do we have to like ultimately boil it all down to the actions and the beliefs of individuals?
Right, right. Like, do those big social things have like their own, sort of independent existence?
Yeah.
Or is it all just like, a bunch of individual actions all added up together? I mean, it's not just one big question, is it? I mean, the sources you sent point to like different aspects of this debate, right?
Yeah, totally. It sort of splits into these two like interconnected areas. First, we've got the dispensability question, which is like, do we even need to talk about social phenomena at all? Like, could we get away with just explaining everything in terms of individuals if we were like clever enough? And then there's the micro foundations question, which is like, even if we say, okay, sometimes it's useful to talk about social things, do we always have to like show how those social things connect to what individuals are doing?
Yeah. Okay. I'm starting to see how those two things fit together. So, like, if we were looking at, I don't know, like a decline in voter turnout, right? A holist might say, oh, it's because of like this general sense of apathy or like, people feeling disconnected from the political system. But a methodological individualist would be like, hold on, show me how all those individual decisions not to vote, actually add up to that overall decline.
Exactly. And the dispensability question asks, like, is that first move talking about this general social apathy? Is that even a legitimate move in the first place? And then the micro foundations debate is like, okay, maybe apathy plays a role, but how does that like translate into people actually staying home on election day? What are the mechanisms?
Okay, so that's really helpful. So let's dig into this dispensability question first. Are we basically trying to figure out if like those explanations that talk about social stuff are like essential, or if the individualists are right when they say, look, all the real action is at the level of individuals? And I guess the sources lay out like three main positions on this, right?
Yeah, that's right. So you've got like strong methodological holism, which is kind of like the hardcore holist position, right?
Mhm.
They say that the only explanations we really need are the ones that talk about social phenomena, and we should just like ditch the individualist stuff altogether. But as your sources point out, that's kind of a fringe view these days. It's hard to imagine explaining anything in society without at least talking about individuals in some way, right?
Yeah, that seems pretty radical. So then we've got like the more moderate version, moderate methodological holism. What's the main idea there?
So the moderate holists, they're like, look, both types of explanations are useful. Sometimes, it makes sense to talk about social factors to explain something, and sometimes it makes more sense to focus on individuals. They're not saying one is always better than the other. It depends on what you're trying to explain and what kind of understanding you're looking for. And this, more balanced approach is generally seen as the dominant form of holism today.
Okay, so it's all about choosing the right tool for the job, kind of, right?
Yeah.
Like sometimes the social level is the right level of analysis, and sometimes it's the individual level. Makes sense. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the methodological individualists who are saying, nope, ultimately it all comes down to individuals. Even if those social explanations seem convenient sometimes, they should always be replaceable, at least in principle, with a more fine-grained account of individuals.
Right. And the interesting thing is, both sides might agree that understanding individuals is important. But where they disagree is whether those holist explanations, those explanations that talk about social stuff, whether they add something genuinely new and important that can't be captured by just talking about individuals. Like, can we always reduce those social explanations to individual ones?
Yeah, I see the tension there. And one of the things that struck me from the sources is how tricky it is to even like define what counts as a holist explanation versus an individualist one.
Yeah.
It's not always clear cut, is it?
No, it's not. So, like, the basic way people distinguish them is by saying holist explanations refer to social phenomena, things like organizations, social processes, those big statistical trends you see in populations, cultures, and traditions, and even like collective intentions or, group mental states. And then you've got norms and rules, so social networks, social roles, and like those big social structures, the kind of things sociologists talk about. Individualist explanations, on the other hand, they zero in on individuals, like their actions, beliefs, desires, choices, how they interact, that kind of thing.
Right. Okay, so it's about what kind of stuff the explanation is built on. But then, like you were saying, it gets blurry because the methodological individualists, they'll often argue that some of those things on the holist list, they aren't really social in the way that holists think they are.
Yeah, exactly. They might say, like, look, a social norm, it's really just a pattern of individual beliefs and actions that's really widespread. Or a social role, it's just a bunch of actions that individuals tend to perform in certain situations. So they're reducing those seemingly social things to, like, aggregates of individual properties.
So then you get this like fundamental disagreement about what those things actually are, which then leads to a disagreement about how to classify the explanations that use them. Like, what a holist sees as a genuine social explanation, an individualist might see as ultimately individualist in disguise.
Exactly. It's like they're operating with different dictionaries almost, right? They disagree about the fundamental building blocks of social reality, and the sources also talk about like different ways to categorize explanations based on like the relationship between the explanans and the explanandum, which are just fancy words for like the thing doing the explaining and the thing being explained, right?
Yeah, that always trips me up. Explained M's. Always have to look those up. But yeah, I get it. So like you could have a situation where both the thing doing the explaining and the thing being explained are social, like maybe a change in economic policy leads to, I don't know, a shift in societal values or something. Or you could have a social thing explaining an individual action, or the other way around, or even one individual explaining what another individual does.
Right. But the most common way of looking at it is to say, like, if an explanation uses any social phenomena in its explanation, then it's a holist explanation. It doesn't matter if the thing being explained is social or individual. And on the flip side, if it only uses individual stuff to explain, then it's an individualist explanation.
Okay, so it's all about the ingredients, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And the sources also mention that both holist and individualist explanations can like take different forms, right? You've got functional explanations, intentional explanations, and then just like straightforward causal explanations. Can you give us some like quick examples of, I don't know, a holist functional explanation and a holist intentional one, just to make those categories a bit clearer?
Sure, yeah. So a holist functional explanation might be something like the institution of private property exists because it, promotes economic efficiency at the societal level. So it's saying that the function that private property serves for society as a whole, like economic efficiency, is what explains why that institution exists. And then a whole intentional explanation that could be something like the UN passed that resolution on climate change because the international community collectively intended to address global warming. So there you're attributing an intention, like a conscious goal, to a collective entity, the UN or the international community, to explain why they did what they did.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. And even when the methodological individualists might like grudgingly accept those holist explanations in some cases, they often see them as kind of like provisional, right? Like they're just placeholders until we can get a deeper explanation at the individual level.
Yeah, that's a key part of their view. They might say, okay, that holist explanation is a useful starting point, but the real goal is to figure out how all those individual actions and motivations are producing that social outcome. So it's like the individual level is where the real like causal story is being told.
All right, so now we get to the heart of the dispensability debate. The arguments about why holist explanations might actually be indispensable, why we can't always just reduce them to individual terms. And the sources outlined, like a bunch of these arguments. Let's start with the argument from social phenomena as causes. This one seems like a pretty direct challenge to methodological individualism.
Yeah, this is kind of their foundational argument, you could say. The basic idea is if social phenomena can cause things to happen, if they have real causal power, then we need holist explanations to describe those causal relationships. Like if we see that an increase in social inequality leads to, I don't know, more political instability, then we need a way to talk about that causal link at the social level. A purely individualist explanation might miss that connection.
Right. Okay. So it's like if those big social forces can actually push things around in the world, then we need a way to talk about them as causes.
Yeah.
Now, I know there was this like earlier version of this argument that kind of portrayed social entities as having like this almost mystical power, like they were acting independently of the individuals in them.
Yeah, that's right. There were thinkers like Comte and Hegel, and even Marx to some extent, who were sometimes interpreted as saying that things like the nation or society had a kind of like agency of their own. It was almost like they were imagining a collective consciousness controlling everything. But that kind of strong holism, it's not really taken seriously anymore.
Right. It sounds a little too mystical for most social scientists. So what are the more modern versions of this argument? I know they often involve these concepts of supervenience and realization, which are pretty philosophical terms, but important ones for this debate.
Yeah, they are. So supervenience basically means that social properties depend on individual properties. Like, you can't have a change in a social property without there also being some change at the individual level. And realization is kind of the flip side of that. It's the idea that individual properties realize or make up the social property.
Okay, so like, I don't know, if we're talking about a society becoming more democratic, that would involve changes in laws and institutions, right? But those changes in laws and institutions would ultimately depend on changes in the beliefs and actions of individuals, like the people writing the laws, the people voting, and so on. Those individual changes would realize the social change.
Exactly. But then the challenge for the holist is like, if all the real causal action is happening at the individual level, then those social properties, are they just kind of like, oh, along for the ride? Do they actually have any causal power themselves? And this is where the exclusion argument comes in, which says that if individual properties are doing all the causal work, then those social properties are just epiphenomenal. They're not really doing anything themselves.
Right. So it's like if the individuals are the ones turning the gears, then the social stuff is just kind of like the noise the gears make. It's there, but it's not actually making anything happen. But I know List and Speakerman, they try to counter this exclusion argument using this idea of difference making, right?
Yeah, they're like, look, a social property can be a genuine cause if it makes a difference to what happens. And they introduce this idea of micro-realization robustness, which basically means that the social property would still cause the same effect even if it was realized by different individuals. So it's not about the specific individuals, it's about the social property itself.
And they use that example of the Copenhagen Climate Summit to illustrate this, right?
Yeah.
The one that, didn't really achieve much.
Exactly. They argue that the failure of that summit was caused by like the sheer number of countries involved and the fact they had all these conflicting interests. And they say that even if you had different negotiators there with different personalities and backgrounds, those big structural factors, the number of actors and their conflicting interests, would still have probably led to the same outcome. So it's not about the specific individuals, it's about those social properties themselves.
Okay, so it's like those big social factors set the stage, and even if you change the actors, the play is still likely to end the same way. Makes sense. And then there's another argument about emergence, right? Which is like a whole other way of thinking about how social things can have causal power. This one is associated with critical realism, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Critical realism it's a whole philosophical approach to science. But in this context, it's relevant because of how it understands emergence. So the basic idea is that when individuals come together and form these larger social entities like, companies or universities or even just informal groups, new properties emerge that weren't present in the individuals themselves.
So it's not just that you're adding up individual properties like 2 + 2 = 4. It's that something new is being created, like 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah, exactly. And these emergent properties, they have their own causal powers. Like, think about a CEO's power to hire and fire people. That power comes from the social structure of the company, not just from the CEO's personality or whatever. Or think about a university's reputation. That's an emergent property of the university as a whole. It's not just the sum of the reputations of all the individual professors.
Right. So those emergent properties are like a new layer of reality, and they can have real effects on both the individuals within the social entity and on other social entities.
Exactly. And that's why, some holists argue that you can't fully explain social phenomena just by looking at individuals. You have to also consider those emergent social properties and how they're influencing things.
Okay, so that's another way of arguing that those social things have real causal bite. Now, what about this argument from the impossibility of translation? That one sounds pretty philosophical.
Yeah, it is. It's the idea that some of the concepts we use to talk about social phenomena, they just can't be translated into individualistic terms without losing something important. Like, you can't define them just in terms of individual beliefs and desires and actions. And the classic example here is the bank teller, which was brought up by Maurice Mandelbaum.
Right, I remember that one. It's like, how do you even define a bank teller without talking about a bank, which itself involves all these other social concepts like money and contracts and so on?
Exactly. Mandelbaum argued that, social concepts are all interconnected like that. You can't just reduce them to individualistic building blocks. And so, if you're trying to explain something that involves these kinds of irreducible social concepts, you need holist explanations. You can't just translate them away into individualistic terms.
Okay, so it's like the very language we use to talk about social things, it already presupposes a kind of holism. We can't escape it.
That's the idea. Now, not all holists rely heavily on this translational argument these days, but it was quite influential historically.
Right, and then we have this argument from the impossibility of intertheoretic reduction, which gets into some pretty heavy-duty philosophy of science stuff. Basically, it's about whether social theories, which often underpin holist explanations, can be reduced to individualist theories. And this often revolves around this Magillian model of reduction, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the Magillian model, it's a classic model of how one scientific theory can be reduced to another. And it involves these two conditions, connectability and derivability. Connectability means that you can link the concepts of the theory being reduced, in this case the social theory, to the concepts of the reducing theory, which would be the individualist theory. And ideally, you do this through these one-to-one bridge laws that connect the two.
Right. So it's like if you could say, okay, this concept in the social theory, it means exactly the same thing as this other concept in the individualist theory, then you've got connectability.
Exactly. And then derivability means that you can take the laws and generalizations of the social theory and logically derive them from the laws and generalizations of the individualist theory using those bridge laws.
Okay, so it's like if you can show that the social theory is just a special case of the individualist theory, then you've reduced it.
Right. But then the argument goes, this is really hard to do in the social sciences because of this problem of multiple realizability. Basically, it means that the same social property can be realized by lots of different individual properties. Like you could have a revolution in one country that's caused by, economic hardship, and then a revolution in another country that's caused by religious persecution. So the same social phenomenon, revolution, is realized by different individual level factors in each case.
Right, so it's like there's no one-to-one mapping between the social and the individual. And if you can't get that connectability, then you can't really do a Magillian reduction.
Exactly. And this multiple realizability argument, it's a pretty powerful challenge to the idea that we can always reduce social theories to individualist ones. And so that lends support to the idea that holist explanations are indispensable. They're capturing something that those individualist theories just can't fully grasp.
Okay, so that's another point for the holists. Now, what about this argument from explanatory regress? That one sounds kind of similar to the reduction argument, but it seems to be attacking the very idea that individualist explanations are always better.
Yeah, that's right. It's saying, look, if you think that individualist explanations are better just because they focus on the smaller parts, then why stop at individuals? Why not go down to biology and then chemistry and then physics? Where do you draw the line?
So it's like if you're always going to prefer the explanation that breaks things down into smaller bits, then you'll never be satisfied. You'll always be looking for a more fundamental level of explanation.
Exactly. And so the argument is that this kind of thinking, it leads to an absurd regress. You'll never get to a final explanation because there's always something smaller to look at.
So it's not so much a defense of holism as it is a critique of the individualist's obsession with reductionism.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. It's saying that this whole idea of always preferring the more reductionist explanation, it's just not a good principle to follow. And if we abandon that principle, then there's no reason to think that holist explanations are inherently inferior.
Okay, that makes sense. So what's next on the list of arguments for indispensability?
The next one is the argument from differing explanatory interests. And this is really about recognizing that different kinds of questions call for different kinds of explanations. So it's not always about finding the most fundamental or reductionist explanation. It's about finding the explanation that best answers the question you're asking.
And this connects to that arithmetic model of explanation we talked about earlier, right?
Yeah.
The one that says explanation is all about answering why questions.
Yeah, exactly. So some holists argue that there are why questions that can only be answered satisfactorily by appealing to social phenomena. Like if you're asking, why did this social movement emerge when it did? A holist explanation might talk about, the social conditions that made people receptive to that movement's message, or the political opportunities that made it possible for the movement to gain traction. And those are social level factors. You can't really explain them just by looking at individuals.
Right. So it's not just about finding any explanation. It's about finding the explanation that best fits the question.
Exactly. And then there's another version of this argument that focuses on the different kinds of information that holist and individualist explanations provide. This is the causal information view put forward by Jackson and Pettit.
Right, and they talk about this distinction between modally comparative and modally contrastive information. Those are pretty technical terms, but I think the basic idea is that holist explanations tell us what would likely happen given a certain social property, whereas individualist explanations tell us what happened because of the specific individuals involved.
Yeah, that's a good summary. So a holist explanation is more like, given this social structure, this kind of outcome is likely to happen, regardless of who the specific individuals are. It's about those general tendencies. Whereas an individualist explanation is more like, this specific outcome happened because these particular individuals did these particular things. It's more focused on the details of that specific case.
And Jackson and Pettit argue that both kinds of information can be valuable, depending on what you're interested in.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes you want to understand those general social tendencies, and sometimes you want to know the specifics of how something happened in a particular case.
Makes sense. So it's not about one type of explanation being better than the other. It's about choosing the right type of explanation for the kind of information you're looking for.
Right. And then the final argument for the indispensability of holist explanations is the argument from pragmatic concerns. And this one is more about like the practical realities of doing social science research.
Okay, so it's less about the philosophical stuff and more about the nitty-gritty of actually doing research.
Yeah, exactly. So this argument points out that sometimes holist explanations are just more practical. Like maybe they're easier to test empirically, or maybe they're easier to communicate to a wider audience.
Right, so it's like if you're trying to study something like, I don't know, the effects of globalization on income inequality, it might be a lot easier to work with data on like trade flows and financial markets than to try to track the individual choices of millions of people.
Exactly. And then even if you could get all that individual level data, it might be really hard to communicate your findings in a way that makes sense to people. Like a holist explanation that focuses on those big social forces might be more accessible to a broader audience.
Okay, so those pragmatic considerations can sometimes tip the scales in favor of holist explanations.
Right. And that wraps up the main arguments for the indispensability of holist explanations. It's a pretty diverse set of arguments, as you can see, drawing on different philosophical ideas and even practical concerns.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, but it's really fascinating stuff. So now let's shift gears and talk about the microfoundations debate. We're no longer arguing about whether we need holist explanations at all. We're assuming that we do. But the question now is, do we always need to supplement those holist explanations with accounts of the individual level mechanisms that are at work?
Exactly. It's like, even if we accept that social phenomena can have causal powers, do we always need to zoom in and see how those social forces are playing out at the individual level? Do we need to open up the black box and see what's going on inside?
And the two main positions here are, again, methodological holism, which says that sometimes those purely holist explanations are good enough, and methodological individualism, which says, nope, you always need those individual level micro foundations. So to start off, what exactly counts as a purely holist explanation in this context?
So in this debate, a purely holist explanation is one where both the thing doing the explaining and the thing being explained are social phenomena. So it's like saying this social thing caused this other social thing without mentioning individuals at all.
Okay, and can you give some examples that, what would be a classic example of a purely holist explanation?
Sure, yeah. So one famous example is Max Weber's argument about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. He argued that this particular set of religious beliefs, the Protestant ethic, contributed to the rise of modern capitalism. So it's a social phenomenon, a religious belief system, explaining another social phenomenon, an economic system. Or you could take the claim that the Great Depression caused World War II. That's saying that a global economic crisis, a social phenomenon, led to a major international conflict, another social phenomenon.
Right. So in those explanations, it's all about the big social forces. No mention of what individual people are doing or thinking.
Exactly. And then on the other side, you have the methodological individualists who are saying, look, even if those holist explanations seem plausible, you always need to show how they connect to what individuals are doing. And that's where the idea of individual level microfoundations comes in.
Right. So it's about like tracing the causal chain down to the level of individuals. Like if we're talking about the Protestant ethic and capitalism, a methodological individualist would want to know, okay, but how did those religious beliefs actually lead to people behaving in ways that fostered capitalism? What were the specific choices and actions that individuals took?
Exactly. And those individual level microfoundations, they often follow this three-part structure. First, you have the social phenomenon influencing individual beliefs, desires, or opportunities. Then you have those individual level factors leading to specific actions and interactions. And finally, you have those individual actions and interactions aggregating up to produce another social phenomenon.
Okay, so it's like you start with the social, then you go down to the individual, then you come back up to the social again. It's like a loop or something.
Yeah, and you can actually visualize this with what's called Coleman's boat. It's this diagram that James Coleman used to illustrate this idea of microfoundations. You have the macro level social factor at the top, then it flows down to the individual level, then you have individual actions at the bottom of the boat, and then it aggregates back up to another macro level social phenomenon. It's a nice way to picture it.
Right, so it's like the social stuff sets the stage, then individuals act on that stage, and their actions create a new social reality. Now, I know this demand for microfoundations, it often comes from a commitment to the mechanism model of explanation, right? Like the idea that to really explain something, you need to show the mechanisms by which it works.
Yeah, exactly. So for the methodological individualists who are pushing for microfoundations, a good explanation is one that shows how the causal process works at the level of individuals. They want to see the gears turning, so to speak.
But do all methodological individualists say that you always need microfoundations, or do some of them have a more like relaxed view?
Yeah, there's some variation there. Some methodological individualists might say that, like, okay, you can have a purely holist explanation, but it's not really satisfying or complete explanation until you add the microfoundations. It's more about explanatory adequacy than about whether something counts as an explanation at all.
Okay, so it's like the holist explanation might be on the right track, but it's still kind of superficial until you dig down to the individual level.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. So now let's look at the arguments for why those purely holist explanations might actually be fine on their own, without always needing those individual level details. And one of the key arguments here is the argument from underlying social level mechanisms.
Okay, and this one seems to be pushing back against the idea that the only mechanisms worth talking about are the individual level ones.
Yeah, exactly. It's saying, look, social reality is organized in layers. So you might have a holist explanation that connects two high-level social phenomena, like, I don't know, the decline of manufacturing jobs and the rise of populism. But you don't necessarily need to go down to the individual level to explain that connection. You could explain it by talking about, like, the actions of corporations, the policies of governments, the dynamics of international trade, all of which are social level factors.
Right, so it's like you can have mechanisms within mechanisms. You don't always have to go all the way down to the individual level to find a satisfying explanation.
Exactly. And another argument against the absolute necessity of microfoundations is the argument from mechanism regress. This one is a bit more philosophical, but it's basically saying that if you take this idea of mechanisms too far, you end up in a never-ending search for deeper and deeper explanations.
So it's like if you're always going to demand a mechanistic explanation for everything, then you'll never be satisfied. You'll always be asking, but what's the mechanism for that mechanism?
Exactly. And so this argument is basically saying, look, we have to stop somewhere. We can't keep demanding ever more detailed mechanistic accounts. At some point, we have to accept that we've reached a level of explanation that's good enough.
And they point out that, like, we don't always demand detailed mechanistic explanations in other areas of life, right? Like, if I say the ball broke the window, I don't need to give you a lecture on physics to explain what happened.
Exactly. So why should social science be any different? Why should we always demand those individual level mechanisms when we often accept explanations without them in other contexts?
Okay, so that's another challenge to the idea that microfoundations are always necessary. What else do the holists have up their sleeve?
Another argument they make is the argument from explanatory practices. And this one is really about looking at how we actually explain things in practice, both in everyday life and in science.
So it's like they're looking at what we actually do when we explain things, rather than just focusing on some abstract philosophical ideal.
Exactly. And they point out that, we often accept explanations that don't specify all the underlying mechanisms. Like if a doctor tells you that you have a cold because you were exposed to a virus, you probably accept that explanation without demanding a detailed account of how the virus actually entered your body and started replicating.
Right. We just kind of like accept that that's how colds work. We don't need all the gory details.
Exactly. And so the holists are saying, look, if we're willing to accept explanations without detailed mechanisms in other areas of life, why should we always demand them for social explanations? Sometimes a purely holist explanation is good enough.
Okay. So it's about being realistic about how explanation actually works in the real world.
Right. And then the final argument they make is the argument from non-mechanistic explanatory considerations. And this one is about recognizing that there are other ways of thinking about explanation besides the mechanism model. Like maybe sometimes we're not interested in the causal mechanisms. Maybe we're interested in something else.
And one example of this is like the arithmetic model again, right? The one that focuses on answering why questions.
Yeah, exactly. So some holists argue that there are why questions that are best answered by purely holist explanations, even if those explanations don't specify any individual level mechanisms. Like if you're asking why did this revolution happen in this country but not in that country, a holist explanation might focus on differences in the political structures or the economic conditions of the two countries. And that kind of explanation can be perfectly satisfactory, even without going into the details of how those structural differences actually played out at the individual level.
Right. So sometimes the focus is on those big structural factors, and the individual level details are just not that important for answering the question at hand.
Exactly. And another example of this is when we're looking for explanations that are very general, that apply across lots of different cases, like the relationship between the money supply and inflation. That's a very general relationship that holds true in lots of different contexts.
Right. And if you tried to give a specific mechanistic account of how that relationship works in every single case, it would get really complicated and messy.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes it's more useful to have a simpler, more abstract explanation that captures the general pattern, even if it doesn't specify all the individual level details.
Yeah.